Jerome Powell just cut interest rates. Again, it's everywhere. CNBC is losing its mind, Twitter's flooded with memes, and everyone's thinking, great, things are finally getting cheaper. But go check your mortgage rate. Still expensive. Check your credit card APR, still over 20%. Check your neighbor's car payment from last month. Still brutal. So if the Fed supposedly has full control over interest rates, why isn't any of this moving? And this isn't about the Fed being slow. It's not about policy taking time to filter through the economy. This is about something far more ironic. The Fed actually only controls one small number at one end that isn't even that important to your life. Meanwhile, the number that actually decides your mortgage rate, your credit card interest, and your stock portfolio's value, that's not in their hands at all. And once you understand who actually controls that, you'll realize every time Powell walks up to that podium, you're watching someone whose power is half illusion. To understand this, we need to back up to the bigger picture. Because for decades, the story we've all been fed is simple. The Fed is the god of interest rates. They meet, they decide a number, and the entire economy falls in line. It's a comfortable picture, easy to understand, perfect for a two-line headline. But that picture is only half the story, because the yield curve, the chart of government bond yields across different maturities, has two ends. The short end, that's the Fed's territory, that includes the Fed funds rate, and one number that rarely gets discussed but is actually far more critical to the day-to-day financial system called SOFR, the Secured Overnight Financing Rate. Think of it as an overnight receipt for the entire US financial system, a number showing what it actually cost to borrow money overnight, based on real settled transactions. This short end really is in the Fed's hands. They are the ones steering it, but the long end of that curve, the 10-year, 20-year, 30-year bonds, that's a completely different story. And here's what's actually happening. The long end isn't decided in an FOMC meeting. It's decided by who wants to buy and who doesn't. Okay, so this doesn't stay abstract. Let's break it down piece by piece, domino by domino. First domino. The US government every single year borrows a dizzying amount of money, trillions of dollars in deficits every year. To cover that deficit, the Treasury has to sell new bonds in massive quantities almost every week. Picture a store that has to keep selling more and more inventory every week, forever, just to cover this month's payroll. Second domino. Who actually buys that much debt? For decades, the answer was clear. Foreign central banks, giant pension funds, insurance companies, and foreign investors who didn't mind a tiny yield as long as it was stable. Japan, for example, became one of the most consistent buyers of US debt for 3 decades, because back home their own yields were at zero, sometimes even negative. So for them, buying US bonds wasn't a choice. It was a mathematical necessity. Third domino. And this is where things start to wobble. Once these loyal buyers start pulling back, whether because their own domestic yields rise or because they start doubting America's ability to pay back its debt, demand at bond auctions starts weakening. And when demand weakens while the supply of bonds stays mountain-sized, the price of those bonds has to drop to attract new buyers. And remember, bond prices down means yields up. That's an inverse relationship that doesn't negotiate. Fourth domino. And this is the core of this entire video. The Fed could cut the Fed funds rate all the way to zero if it wanted to. But if the market doesn't trust America's long-term fiscal situation, the 10-year and 30-year yields can stay elevated, or even climb higher. This is what's called a steepening yield curve, where the curve goes from flat to steep because the short end drops, but the long end refuses to budge. And here's exactly why this matters for your life, directly. Mortgage rates aren't pegged to the Fed funds rate. They are pegged to the 10-year Treasury yield. So if the 10-year yield doesn't come down, even after the Fed has cut rates multiple times, your mortgage rate isn't coming down either. This is why people waiting for Fed cuts, so they can finally afford a house, often discover a bitter truth: their mortgage rate barely moved, or didn't move at all. The same goes for stock valuations. Analysts modeling what a stock is actually worth discount future cash flows, using long-term yields as their baseline. If that yield stays elevated, the present value of those future earnings shrinks in their models. which means valuations can get compressed even if the company itself is doing fine, even if quarterly earnings look great. Not because the company is broken, but because the price of money itself has changed. Now back to why this isn't just about mortgages or stocks. Because once long-term yields stop cooperating, the effect spreads like water leaking from a pipe into everything. Corporations looking to issue new debt for expansion suddenly face higher borrowing costs. So they get more cautious about hiring or opening new locations. The government itself gets hit the hardest because interest on old debt that has to be rolled into new debt automatically becomes more expensive. Picture a giant credit card worth tens of trillions of dollars, and every time a payment comes due, you have to refinance it at a higher rate than before. That's exactly what's happening to the US government right now. Interest payments on its own debt are becoming one of the largest line items in the entire federal budget. And here's where it gets interesting, because this creates a strange loop. Big deficits force the government to issue more debt. More debt pushes yields up if demand doesn't grow to match. Higher yields make the government's own interest bill bigger, and a bigger interest bill makes next year's deficit even worse. Economists have a name for this loop: fiscal dominance, a situation where government fiscal policy, not the Fed's monetary policy, ends up dictating the direction of long-term interest rates. And if that's what's actually happening, then the FOMC meeting everyone tunes in for is really only half the story. Maybe even just a third of it. So the question now becomes, if the Fed doesn't actually hold full control, then who does? And the answer isn't glamorous at all. The answer is the weekly bond auction results, a boring number called the bid-to-cover ratio, which shows how much demand there was compared to the supply of bonds being sold. If that ratio starts weakening week after week, that's a far more important signal for your economic future than anything Powell says in front of a camera. And this is exactly why traditional financial media never really covers this seriously. Because Fed press conferences are telegenic. There's a face, there's drama, there are sound bites that chop neatly into headlines, but Treasury auction results, that's just a spreadsheet full of numbers that drops every week with no press conference, no face, no drama. Nobody's writing breaking news about the bid-to-cover ratio slipping from 2.4 to 2.1, even though that's far more predictive of where your mortgage rate is heading than anything said on Capitol Hill. So, let's sum it up. The Fed really does steer short-term rates, and that matters for things like savings account yields or short-term credit card rates. But the actual engine driving your mortgage, your stock valuations, and corporate borrowing costs is determined by who's still willing to buy America's debt and at what price. And once those loyal buyers start hesitating, no FOMC meeting can force them to change their minds. So, next time Powell steps up to that podium talking about a rate cut, don't cheer right away. Check what happened at that week's bond auction first. Because that's where the real story's being written, far from the cameras, far from the headlines, and in exactly the place nobody bothers to watch. And if you want to keep seeing the parts of the economy that never make headlines but actually decide what happens to your wallet, hit subscribe. Because I'll keep digging up the mechanics that mainstream media conveniently skips, one video at a time. See you in the next one.